Hi everyone, welcome to your lecture on the Introduction to Sensation and Perception. When we start talking about sensation and perception, we need to make sure that we have the definitions down for these two terms. When we talk about sensation, we're talking about anything that is going to come from your environment, and so we'll use the term stimulus quite often. These stimuli are going to be converted into neural signals that your brain will understand. So this raw energy from the world, whether it is a light wave, a sound wave, pressure from an object, or a chemical sense like sense of taste or sense of smell, all of these things have to be transferred into a chemical or a neurochemical signal. So this raw information is our sensations. We will use all of this sensory information, whether it's coming from our five senses or a sense of balance or a kinesthetic sense. We're going to put them into kind of an organized way of looking at the world. We're going to interpret the world through these sensations. We may not use all of the information equally. We may not use it fully, and that process is called perception. So perception is going to be unique to the individual to a certain degree. How we perceive our world is based on what we pay attention to, but also based on what we choose to not pay attention to. Two types of processing when it comes to looking at stimuli and then also looking at how we understand our world. First one is bottom-up processing. With bottom-up processing, we begin with the basic stimulus, just the raw information coming from our environment. Here, if we're looking at the letter A, the first time you saw this, you may have seen three lines, one horizontal, two angled in, and later maybe you were even told that this symbol had a sound associated with it. Your first understanding of it is going from basic sensation and building up what we'll later call a precept or an understanding of what it is. We're going from these letters to giving it meaning like it is the letter A. Feature analysis is going to be detecting specific elements in visual input and assembling them into a more complex form. Feature analysis happens in the occipital lobe of your brain, and it uses very specific cells called feature detection cells. These cells are going to specifically fire for different aspects of visual information. So here you have a rectangle at the bottom. The horizontal and the vertical lines. Horizontal lines will have a specific firing, vertical lines will have another set of firing. You'll have very specific cells in the back of your brain in the occipital lobe that will pick up these elements and later bind them together into what we will call our precept or the rectangle, what we understand, what we're familiar with. Top-down processing is going to be the other type of processing. Instead of going from sensory information to understanding, we're using understanding to guide what we are experiencing. So experience and expectation is really important in this one. We talked about in class the cat, which is down below, and again, the H and the A are the exact same symbol, but within context, because of our experience and our understanding of language, we read it as the cat. It's the only thing that makes sense. Experience and expectation is also going to be the foundation for Gestalt psychology, perceptual psychology, going from our experience to understanding our world. Still looking at top-down processing, we have two pixelated images, one made out of Legos and one just pixelated. You may, if you've had experience with either of these, already know what these pictures are. So if you've had zero experience, if you've never seen them before, you have no expectation, you can't tell me what these two images are. So you would bottom up process. You would look at the form, the shape, you would try to take it all in, but again, you would come up with pixelated pictures. Top-down processing works if you've had this experience before. So if you've seen the Mona Lisa, the picture to the left is easily identified as the Mona Lisa, even though the correct physical characteristics are not there. The picture to the right, David Beckham. If you've never watched soccer or you don't know who David Beckham is, this picture is going to be meaningless to you. However, if you've had experience with watching Manchester United or you are a fan of, I don't know, Hollywood, you may have seen the face before, and even though this is pixelated and doesn't show clear detail, you have previous experience filling in who you believe is in this picture. We've gone through and done the I can read it, can you? And again, this is the entire idea that something like reading is a top-down processing activity. We go off of experience. So that's why we only need the first and the last letter and roughly the correct letters in between. So just another way of looking at these two things, bottom up, literally read it from the bottom up. You look at specific stimuli, you combine them, and then you recognize the stimulus. You build up an understanding. Top down, you look at what it is, you make a basically a hypothesis about the entirety of what you're seeing. You see if it checks out correctly with your hypothesis, and then you recognize it for what it is. We will often ping pong between these two. You may start out with an expectation, and then if it doesn't meet your expectation, you may come back and go, all right, what do I detect and what is it exactly, and then build up a new understanding. Best example for this is imagine eating a caramel apple. If you've had experience with that, if someone hands you a stick with a round orb covered in caramel on it, you've probably already in your head decided it's going to be sweet and that the apple on the inside should be crunchy and juicy, a little bit sweet, maybe even a little bit sour, and you're already there. All right, so someone gives you this orb covered in caramel on a stick. You bite into it, you got the sweet from the caramel, and then there's something else there. It's not apple. And let's say they replace the apple with an onion. At that point, your hypothesis doesn't check out. You don't recognize the stimulus. So you go right to bottom-up processing. You detect the specific features. You combine them to kind of determine what it is, and then you recognize what it is. So we top down and bottom up, kind of back and forth. And we do this in just regular life. We see if our hypotheses check out, we see if there's specific elements that we need to pay attention to, and those two kind of feed in how we understand our world. Again, sensory and perceptual processes work together to sort out the complexity of our life. So here, we're going to top-down process every single time we make a facial pattern out of the leaves or the sticks or the rocks. But we'll also bottom-up process as we take in color and information and build it up to precepts. Throughout this unit, we're going to talk in terms of psychophysics, the relationship between our stimuli and our experience of them. So when we talk about light, we're usually talking about brightness, and we'll investigate wavelengths. We talk about sound, we're going to be talking about volume, and again, we'll be looking at sound waves. When we talk about pressure, we're going to be talking about weight. When we talk about taste, we're going to be talking about terms like sweetness, salty, bitter, umami, all of the different tastes that we have. When we talk about your olfactory or your sense of smell, we'll talk about chemical odorants. All of these things are going to help build up how we understand our world. While we talk about sensation and perception, we're going to start also talking about things called thresholds. The first threshold that we'll talk about is your absolute threshold. And when we talk about absolute thresholds, we're talking about the absolute minimum amount of stimulation needed to detect an environmental stimulus 50% of the time. So this is purely sensation based. Now what that means is that if we're getting to the 50% mark, that means flip of a coin. 50% of the time you don't detect it, 50% of the time you do detect it. But at 50%, there is an equal chance that it's detected. If it is below 50%, we're going to start calling that subliminal. Above 50%, we're just looking at your sensitivity to something. An absolute threshold is the minimum. It's always the absolute minimum of stimulation needed to detect something. So if you are standing in a dark room, how much illumination, how many lumens do you need? How much light do you need before you can sit there and say, I believe there's light in the room, and be correct? If you are in a completely silent room, how much sound needs to be present before you can detect sound? And it has to be at this rate of at least 50% of the time. If we're looking at this as an indication of when you observe light, let's assume that the first light bulb second, we're seeing slight increases. No, you see no change. No, you see no change. Nope, still you're not detecting the light. The minute you get to the yes, the first time that the observer responds that they've detected it, at that point you have an absolute threshold, especially if they're hitting it 50% of the time. Other examples of absolute minimum thresholds: a candle flame seen at 30 miles on a dark, clear night. Now that seems extreme, but we're talking about the fact that 50% of the time you might be able to detect it. More realistic, I think, for our heads, the tick of a watch under quiet conditions at 20 feet. So just that kind of very quiet ticking. If the room is absolutely silent, no competing sound, how sensitive are you to sound? You will get questions like this on your test. You'll have questions about when someone can detect how far away the ice cream truck is compared to a sibling who can detect it sooner. When we talk about absolute thresholds, the easiest way that I have found to kind of understand them or keep them clear in my head is using something like pain tolerance. When we talk about someone who has a low tolerance for pain or a very kind of high tolerance for pain, we're usually talking in terms of threshold. So if someone has a high pain threshold or a high tolerance for pain, they need lots and lots and lots of pain before they detect it. If someone has a low threshold for pain or a low tolerance for pain, they need a very little amount of pain before they detect it. So when we're talking about things like vision thresholds, if someone has a high threshold for seeing light or vision, they need a lot or a large amount of light to detect it, versus a person who has a small threshold who might need just a little bit of light to detect it. Same thing with sound, taste, smell, etc. The second threshold that you need to know is called the just noticeable difference, or the difference threshold. And again, this is talking about it in terms of absolute minimums. So difference threshold exists when you already have sensitivity to something. You've already detected it. But can you detect a change? So let's say you and a friend are in a room and the room is 68 degrees and you both agree that you can feel the temperature. It's different than the temperature outside, but you sit there and go, I'm going to turn up the thermostat. You turn the thermostat up 2 degrees, so from 68 to 70, and your friend or your roommate goes, all right, it's way too hot in here, I can tell the difference. If you sit there and say, I have yet to detect it, I'm going to add 2 more degrees, and now you've gone from 68 to 72, and you go, now it feels warmer. That 4 degrees difference is your just noticeable difference for temperature at that starting point. So if we're looking at it here again in lumens, or when you determine the light has changed, all right, we're already starting with a clear indication that the observer sees light. Have they seen a change in the light? No. Have they seen it now? Yes. From the no to the yes, that is your difference threshold when they determined a change. When we're talking specifically about the just noticeable difference or the difference threshold, we are talking about something called Weber's law. Weber's law is the idea that it is going to be a proportional change. So what does that mean? Well, if you are in a completely silent room, you need a small change in sound to notice a change. So everyone in the room is whispering and one person talks in their normal volume, you can tell the difference between those two stimuli. But if you're at, say, the pep rally and the entire auditorium or the entire gym is talking in normal voices, the sound is so great that for you to hear a change in the volume, the change would be much greater. So the stimuli must differ by a constant minimum percentage. While Weber's theory talks about just noticeable difference, signal detection theory is addressing the absolute threshold. Now, signal detection theory doesn't support absolute threshold, it in fact refutes it. Signal detection theory says it depends on really 4 different things: a person's experience, their expectations, motivation, and level of fatigue. Those 4 things play into whether or not the person detects a stimuli or how sensitive they are to it. So if you've never had an experience with sensory kind of information, you might not detect it. If you have no expectation for it, you may not be looking for it. If you don't care, you might just bypass it. And if you're really tired, well, being tired offsets a whole lot of stuff. If we're looking at this, if you were at home and you play the drums, phone rings, normally you play right through it. You are motivated to play the drums. You might not be expecting a telephone call. You might not be listening for that. Signal detection theory might say that on that day you don't hear it, but let's say it's a specific day and you're expecting a phone call from a very important person. On that day, your anticipation or your expectation of the phone has changed, and on that day you're far more sensitive. So you're downstairs banging on the drums, and yet you notice when the phone rings. Along with signal detection theory, you need to know the signal detection theory matrix, which essentially is the 4 different outcomes that can happen when we're looking at or detecting a sensory signal. First one is the most obvious, which is the signal was present and you determined that it was there, so we call that a hit. The other one, that would be an optimal one, is that there was no signal and you detected nothing, so it's a correct rejection. The other 2 means that either you should have detected it and you didn't, or you detected something that wasn't there. So a false alarm, if we have a false alarm for like a fire alarm, someone pulls the fire alarm but there is no fire, same thing here. You say that you detected something but you didn't in fact detect it. And then a miss, you should have detected it but you didn't. I think all of us have done those hearing tests in the weird booths. These are really the 4 outcomes. And again, they're impacted by whether you even care how well you do on your hearing test, how much sleep you've gotten the night before, if you've ever done it before, if you have an expectation for it. All of those factors play in huge. I told you guys earlier when we were looking at absolute thresholds, and again here, this is absolute threshold. Anything that falls below the 50% detection is what we'd call subliminal. Now, a subliminal threshold means that you were sensitive to it, you detected it, but that it might not be something that you are consciously aware of all the time. Now, this is where it becomes important. Subliminal mind control does not happen. So this entire idea that we can put in messages or words that can control people's behaviors, that was actually research that was done by a person back in like the 50s or the 60s, but they didn't even really do the research. They made it up. But we were willing to buy into it because it was a Cold War era, and so people thought, yeah, you can put something into a movie and they can turn us all into zombies or force behaviors. Ultimately, what we know with our subliminal threshold is that we might be able to detect it, but we're not going to be correct in our detections most of the time. It's below our fully conscious awareness, below that 50% point. Last couple of concepts, one of them is going to be sensory adaptation. So if you've ever cut your finger and someone came up to you and said, hey, what'd you do? And you can't really figure out what they're talking about because you no longer feel the Band-Aid on your finger, you've experienced sensory adaptation. Literally, the Band-Aid, the first time you put it on your finger, your brain keeps sending messages saying there's something on your hand. There's something on your hand. I'm feeling something on your hand. But over time, you've been getting the message so long and you've chosen not to change or do anything about it, your brain goes, all right, we're going to stop paying attention to this sensory information. It's something we don't need to pay attention to. We do this all the time. We can't pay attention to all of the sensory information that our brain's taking in. I always like to use the example, did you think about wearing underwear? And people kind of look at me weird, but the idea is you wear clothes that are in contact with your body all the time. As long as they don't itch or ride up or make you feel uncomfortable, you forget that your body is in constant contact with your underwear. You've adapted to it. So our sensitivity to certain things diminishes because of the constant stimulation. They've done research where they've stabilized the retina, and your eye constantly twitches back and forth because as cells in your retina fire, they go through an absolute refractory period where they can't fire again. When that occurs, the twitching of the eye elicits firing from different or nearby cells, so our vision seems seamless. But if we were to keep the eye still, if we weren't allowed to let it move back and forth or to twitch, what you would find is your eye would start to show gaps. Your vision would start to show these kind of areas that would start to disappear. And that's because as your eye goes through that absolute refractory period, as those cells fire and have to rest, your vision would then become spotty. Last thing that we need to look at, I would strongly encourage you guys to click on the links below. Selective attention. When we look at selective attention at any moment we focus on awareness at a limited aspect of what we're capable of experiencing. Now it's called also the cocktail party effect because the idea was that if you were in a very large party, everybody having cocktails talking very loudly, that for you to pay attention to the conversation with the person that you're having, you would have to block out everyone around you and focus solely on that person. Selective attention happens all the time in a classroom where you're trying to ignore the chatter around you and pay attention to the teacher, or the reverse. You're blocking out the teacher so you can have the conversation with the person sitting next to you. We're very aware of selective attention. Another part of this in the cocktail party effect is that there are some things that we are primed to pay attention to. And so we have something called late selective attention. In other words, if you're walking in the hallway and let's say your name is Sam, and as Sam is walking in the hallway, Sam hears someone say, I feel the same. Now, I feel the part she's not paying attention to or he's not paying attention to, but the minute they hear same, if they mishear it and they think they heard Sam, they may actually draw their attention away from whatever they're doing and go, yeah, yes. And that's because they have been conditioned and they're primed to respond to their name. They selectively attend to some things, like again, their name. A parent will sleep through a thunderstorm, but will selectively attend to the cry of their child. That cry, even though it's not as loud as the thunderstorm, will wake them up. They will attend to it. So, selective attention, we can only attend to a limited number of things, and in fact, as human beings, we are what they call serial processors. 2.7% of the world's population are considered multitaskers. There's a very slim chance that you are one of them, 2.7 of the global population. So, as we talk about this in numbers, most of us can focus on one attention-consuming activity at a time, which is why when we start talking about don't text and drive, it's because texting takes up a lot of mental energy, but as you're looking down, your attention is focused, you miss out on the world going around you, and that world might be passing you by at 60, 70, 80 miles per hour. All right, this is everything that you guys needed to know. Please review this. We will talk about a lot of these terms over and over again in class, and if you have any questions, please be sure to either hit me up on Remind or talk to me in class about them.